The United States Army Rangers are an elite military formation of the United States Army, that serve in designated U.S. Army Ranger units or are graduates from the U.S. Army Ranger School. The term Ranger has been in use unofficially in a military context since the early 17th century. The first military company officially commissioned as Rangers were English soldiers fighting in King Philip's War, and from there the term came into common official use in the French and Indian Wars. There have been American military companies officially called Rangers since the American Revolution. The 75th Ranger Regiment is an elite airborne light infantry combat formation within the United States Army Special Operations Command. The 6 battalions of the modern Rangers have been deployed in wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and saw action in several conflicts, such as those in Panama and Grenada. The Ranger Regiment traces its lineage to 3 of 6 battalions raised in World War II, and to the 5,307th Composite Unit, known as Merrill's Marauders, and then reflagged as the 475th Infantry, then later as the 75th Infantry. The Ranger Training Brigade, headquartered at Fort Benning, is an organization under the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command and is separate from the 75th Ranger Regiment. It has been in service in various forms since World War II. The Ranger Training Brigade administrates Ranger School, the satisfactory completion of which is required to become Ranger qualified and to wear the Ranger tab. The term Ranger. Organizations define the term Ranger in different ways. For example, the annual Best Ranger competition, hosted by the Ranger Training Brigade, can be won by pairs of participants from the 75th Ranger Regiment, or by Ranger-qualified entrants from other units in the U.S. military. For an individual to be inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Association's Ranger Hall of Fame, they must have served in a Ranger unit in combat or be a successful graduate of the U.S. Army Ranger School. The Ranger Association further clarifies the type of unit. A Ranger unit is defined as those Army units recognized in Ranger lineage or history. Acceptance into the U.S. Army Ranger Association is limited to Rangers that have earned the U.S. Army Ranger tab, World War II Rangers, Korean War Rangers, Vietnam War Rangers, all Rangers that participated in Operations Urgent Fury, Just Cause, Desert Storm, Restore Hope, Enduring Freedom, and all Rangers who have served honorably for at least 1 year in a recognized Ranger unit. There is some dispute over the use of the word Ranger, according to J. D. Locke. The problems of the Ranger tab and indeed Ranger history is in large part caused by the lack of a clear-cut definition of who is a Ranger. The Ranger Department, the Infantry School, and Department of the Army have in the past carelessly accepted the definition of a Ranger unit to include the use of terms Ranger type and units, like Rangers, and Special Mission Units. In his book Raiders or Elite Infantry, David Hogan of the Center for Military History writes that, by the time of the formation of LRRP units, Ranger had become a term of legendary connotations but no precise meaning. For the want of a definition of who and what is a Ranger, integrity was lost. As a result of Grenada, circumstances have changed. Since 1983, men have had the opportunity to earn and wear an authorized Ranger unit scroll or an authorized Ranger tab or both. But there is a need for a firm definition of who and what constitutes a Ranger. Without that definition, we face the likelihood of future controversy. Colonial period. Rangers served in the 17th and 18th century wars between colonists and Native American tribes. The British regulars were not accustomed to frontier warfare and so Ranger companies were developed. Rangers were full-time soldiers employed by colonial governments to patrol between fixed frontier fortifications in reconnaissance, providing early warning of raids. In offensive operations, they were scouts and guides, locating villages and other targets for task forces drawn from the militia or other colonial troops. In colonial America, the earliest mention of ranger operations comes from Captain John Rowart Smith, who wrote in 1622, "When I had 10 men able to go abroad, our commonwealth was very strong. With such a number I ranged that unknown country 14 weeks." Robert Black also stated that, in 1622, after the Berkeley Plantation Massacre, grim-faced men went forth to search out the Indian enemy. They were militia, citizen soldiers, but they were learning to blend the methods of Indian and European warfare, as they went in search of the enemy. The words range, ranging and ranger were frequently used. The American Ranger had been born. The father of American ranging is Colonel Benjamin Church. He was the captain of the 1st Ranger Force in America. Church was commissioned by the governor of the Plymouth colony Josiah Winslow to form the 1st Ranger Company for King Philip's War. He later employed the company to raid Acadia during King William's War and Queen Anne's War. Benjamin Church designed his force primarily to emulate Native American patterns of war. Toward this end, Church endeavored to learn to fight like Native Americans from Native Americans. Americans became Rangers exclusively under the tutelage of the Indian allies. Church developed a special full-time unit mixing white colonists selected for frontier skills with friendly Native Americans to carry out offensive strikes against hostile Native Americans in terrain where normal militia units were ineffective. His memoirs, entertaining passages relating to Philip's War, is considered the first American military manual. Under Church served the father and grandfather of 2 famous Rangers of the 18th century, John Lovewell and John Gorham respectively. John Lovewell served during Dummer's War. He lived in present-day Nashua, New Hampshire. He fought in Dummer's War as a militia captain, leading 3 expeditions against the Abenaki Indians. John Lovewell became the most famous Ranger of the 18th century. During King George's War, John Gorham established Gorham's Rangers. Gorham's company fought on the frontier at Acadia and Nova Scotia. Gorham was commissioned a captain in the regular British Army in recognition of his outstanding service. He was the first of 3 prominent American Rangers, himself, his younger brother Joseph Gorham and Robert Rogers, to earn such commissions in the British Army. Rogers Rangers was established in 1751 by Major Robert Rogers, who organized 9 ranger companies in the American colonies. These early American light infantry units, organized during the French and Indian War, were actively called Rangers, and are often considered to be the spiritual birthplace of the modern Army Rangers. Major Rogers is credited with, among other things, drafting the first set of standard orders for Rangers. These rules, Robert Rogers' 28 Rules of Ranging, are still provided to all new Army Rangers upon graduation from training, and served as one of the first modern manuals for asymmetric warfare. American Revolution. When the American Revolution began, Major Robert Rogers allegedly offered his services to General George Washington. Fearing that Rogers was a spy, Washington refused. An incensed Rogers instead joined forces with the Loyalists and fought for the crown. While serving with the British, Carl Rogers was responsible for capturing America's most famous spy in Nathan Hale. Not all of Rogers' Rangers went with him, however, including such notable figures as Israel Putnam. Later on during the war, General Washington ordered Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton to select an elite group of men for reconnaissance missions. This unit was known as Knowlton's Rangers, and is credited as the first official Ranger unit for the United States. This unit, however, carried out intelligence functions rather than combat functions in most cases, and as such are not generally considered the historical parent of the modern-day Army Rangers. Instead, Knowlton's Rangers gave rise to the modern military intelligence branch. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, Revolutionary Commander of South Carolina, developed irregular methods of warfare against the British Army. As one of the fathers of modern guerrilla warfare, he is credited in the lineage of the Army Rangers. War of 1812. In January 1812, the United States authorized 6 companies of United States Rangers who were mounted infantry with the function of protecting the western frontier. 5 of these companies were raised in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois and Kentucky. The next year, 10 new companies were raised. By December 1813, the Army Register listed officers of 12 companies of Rangers. The Ranger companies were discharged in June 1815. Black Hawk War. During the Black Hawk War, in 1832, the United States Mounted Ranger Battalion was created out of frontiersmen who enlisted for 1 year and provided their own rifles and horses. The battalion was organized into 6 companies of 100 men each that was led by Major Henry Dodge. After their enlistment expired, there was no creation of a 2nd battalion. Instead, the battalion was reorganized into the 1st Dragoon Regiment. American Civil War. The most famous Rangers of the American Civil War fought for the Confederate States Army. In January 1863, John S. Mosby was given command of the 43rd Battalion, Partisan Rangers, a fast-striking cavalry unit. Mosby's Rangers became infamous among Union soldiers due to their frequent raids on supply trains and couriers. Mosby believed that by resorting to aggressive action he could compel his enemies to guard 100 points. He would then attack one of the weakest points and be assured numerical superiority. Their reputation was heightened when Mosby and 29 of his Rangers performed a raid deep into Union territory on March 9, 1863, and captured Brigadier General Edwin H. Stoughton and 2 other officers. Weeks after the surrender of the Confederate Army, Mosby disbanded his unit rather than formally surrender. Also, the Confederate commander, Turner Ashby, led a cavalry company known as the Mountain Rangers, who became known for their ability to harass Union soldiers. The most successful attacks against Mosby's Rangers were carried out by the Union Army's Means Rangers. Means Rangers became famous when they successfully captured General James Longstreet's ammunition train. They later fought and captured a portion of Mosby's force. World War II. Major General Lucien Truscott of the U.S. Army was a liaison officer with the British General Staff. In 1942 he submitted a proposal to General George Marshall that an American unit be set up along the lines of the British Commandos. European Theatre. On June 19, 1942, the 1st Ranger Battalion was sanctioned, recruited, and began training in Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland. Of 500 volunteers who first formed the Rangers at Carrickfergus, only 87 survived by the end of the war. 80% of the original Rangers came from the 34th Infantry Division. A select 50 or so of the 1st U.S. Rangers were dispersed through the British and Canadian commandos for the Jet Raid in August 1942. These were the first American soldiers to see ground combat in the European theatre. Together with the ensuing 3rd and 4th Ranger Battalions, they fought in North Africa and Italy, commanded by Colonel William Orlando Darby, until the Battle of Cisterna, when most of the Rangers of the 1st and 3rd Battalions were captured. Of the 767 men in the battalions, 761 were killed or captured. The remaining Rangers were absorbed into the Canadian-American 1st Special Service Force under Brigadier General Robert T. Frederick. They were then instrumental in operations in and around the Anzio beachhead that followed Operation Shingle. The 29th Ranger Battalion was a temporary unit made of selected volunteers from the 29th Infantry Division that was in existence from December 1942 to November 1943. Before the 5th Ranger Battalion landing on Dog White Sector on Omaha Beach during the invasion of Normandy. The 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled the 90-foot cliffs of Point du Hoc, a few miles to the west, to destroy a 5-gun battery of captured French cannon and 155mm GPF guns. The gun positions were empty on the day and the weapons had been removed some time before to allow the construction of casements in the place. Under constant fire during their climb, they encountered only a small company of Germans on the cliffs and subsequently discovered a group of field artillery weapons in trees some 1,000 yards to the rear. The guns were disabled and destroyed, and the Rangers then cut and held the main road for 2 days before being relieved, all whilst being reinforced by members of the 5th Ranger Battalion who arrived at 6 p.m. on the 6th of June from Omaha Beach. More 5th Ranger units arrived by sea on the 7th of June when some of their wounded along with German prisoners were taken away to the waiting ships. Currently no memorial exists at Point du Hoc to commemorate the actions of the 5th Rangers at Point du Hoc, only one to the members of the 2nd Battalion. However, the American Battle Monuments Commission have said that they will correct this error in the near future. The 5th Rangers along with members of the 2nd BTN then went on to attack the Maisie Battery, which was still firing on both Omaha and Utah beaches. The 23 members of the 5th Battalion who reached and reinforced the 2nd Battalion men at Point du Hoc on the 6th of June won the Presidential Unit Citation for the 5th Rangers, for their deepest penetration of any combat unit on D-Day. Major Richard Sullivan won the Distinguished Service Cross for 3 actions in Normandy. The landings on Omaha Beach, the relief of Point du Hoc and the successful capture of the Maisie Battery. Pacific Theater. 2 separate Ranger units fought the war in the Pacific Theater. The 98th Field Artillery Battalion was formed on the 16th of December 1940 and activated at Fort Lewis in January 1941. On the 26th of September 1944, they were converted from field artillery to light infantry and became 6th Ranger Battalion. 6th Ranger Battalion led the invasion of the Philippines and executed the raid on the Cabanatumpao camp. They continued fighting in the Philippines until they were deactivated on the 30th of December 1945 in Japan. After the First Quebec Conference, the 5,307th Composite Unit was formed with Frank Merrill as the commander. Its 2,997 officers and men became popularly known as Merrill's Marauders. They began training in India on the 31st of October 1943. Much of the Marauders' training was based on Major General Order Wingate of the British Army, who specialized in deep penetration raids behind Japanese lines. The 5,307th Composite Group was composed of the 6 color-coded combat teams that would become part of modern Ranger heraldry. They fought against the Japanese during the Burma Campaign. In February 1944, the Marauders began a 1,000-mile march over the Himalayan mountain range and through the Burmese jungle to strike behind the Japanese lines. By March, they had managed to cut off Japanese forces in Maringkwan and cut their supply lines in the Hukou Valley. On the 17th of May, the Marauders and Chinese forces captured the Myitkyina airfield, the only all-weather airfield in Burma. For their actions, every member of the unit received the Bronze Star motto on the 6th of June 1944, during the assault landing on Dog White sector of Omaha Beach as part of the invasion of Normandy. Then Brigadier General Norman Cotter approached Major Max Schneider, CO of the 5th Ranger Battalion, and asked, "What outfit is this?" Schneider answered, "5th Rangers, sir." To this, Cotter replied, "Well, goddamn-it, if your Rangers lead the way." From this, the Ranger motto, "Rangers lead the way," was born. Korean War. At the outbreak of the Korean War, a unique Ranger unit was formed. Led by 2nd Lieutenant Ralph Puckett, the 8th Army Ranger Company was created in August 1950. It served as the role model for the rest of the soon-to-be-formed Ranger units. Instead of being organized into self-contained battalions, the Ranger units of the Korean and Vietnam eras were organized into companies and then attached to larger units to serve as organic special operations units. In total, 16 additional Ranger companies were formed in the next 7 months. 8th Army Raider Company and 1st through 15th Ranger Company. The Army Chief of Staff assigned the Ranger training program at Fort Benning to Colonel John Gibson Van Houten. The program eventually split to include a training program located in Korea. 3rd Ranger Company and the 7th Ranger Company were tasked to train new Rangers. The next 4 Ranger Companies were formed, the 28th of October 1950. Soldiers from the 505th Airborne Regiment and the 82nd Airborne's 80th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion volunteered and, after initially being designated the 4th Ranger Company, became the 2nd Ranger Company, the only all-black Ranger unit in United States history. After the 4 companies had begun their training, they were joined by the 5th 8th Ranger Companies on the 20th of November 1950. During the course of the war, the Rangers patrolled and probed, scouted and destroyed, attacked and ambushed the Communist Chinese and North Korean enemy. The 1st Rangers destroyed the 12th North Korean Division headquarters in a daring night raid. The 2nd and 4th Rangers made a combat airborne assault near Munsan, where Life magazine reported that Allied troops were now patrolling north of the 38th parallel. Crucially, the 2nd Rangers plugged the gap made by the retreating Allied forces. The 5th Ranger Company helped stop the Chinese 5th phase offensive. As in World War II, after the Korean War, the Rangers were disbanded.